Good evening. Hi, everyone. Welcome and thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Claire, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm pleased to introduce this virtual event with Tomiko Brown-Nagin, presenting Civil Rights Queen, Constance Baker Motley and the Struggle for Equality. She'll be joined in conversation by Randall Kennedy. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our growing digital community during these challenging times. Thank you for joining us tonight in support of our authors, but also in support of the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. Our 2022 events calendar is in full swing, and it appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can also sign up for our email newsletter and even browse our shelves from home. Maybe you'll even find the perfect snow day read for tomorrow. After the introduction, I will be dropping a link in the chat to order a copy of the book. Your purchases and financial contributions, I'll also share a link to donate to the store, make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever support the future of a landmark independent bookstore. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question for our speakers at any time during the talk tonight, you can go to the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen, and we'll get through as many as time allows. The event also has closed captioning available. Depending on the version of Zoom you're using, you may need to enable captions yourself by clicking on the closed caption button on your screen. And finally, as you might have experienced in virtual gatherings over the past, 3 years, technical issues might arise. If they do, we'll do our best to resolve them quickly. Thank you for your patience and understanding. Tomiko Brown-Nagin is Dean of Harvard Radcliffe Institute, as well as a professor at both the law school and in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. And she chairs the Presidential Committee on Harvard and the Legacy of Slavery. She's an award-winning legal historian with a focus on constitutional law and education law and policy. You may be familiar with her critically acclaimed 2011 book, Courage to Dissent, Atlanta and the Long History of the Civil Rights Movement. Tonight, she'll be talking with Randall Kennedy, the Michael R. Klein Professor of Law at Harvard Law School, where he is a noted expert on contracts, criminal law, and the regulation of race relations. He is the author of numerous books, including last year's much lauded Say It Loud on race, law, history, and culture. There are countless biographies of civil rights heroes, but until recently, it was harder to find biographies of heroines of that era. The women who worked just as tirelessly for equality before the law, women like Polly Murray, Fannie Lou Hamer, and Constance Baker Motley. Luckily for readers today, that's changing. And lucky for us, Dean Brown-Nagin's new book chronicles the life and impact of Motley, who was the first Black woman to argue before the Supreme Court, the first Black woman elected to New York State Senate, and the first Black woman appointed to the federal judiciary. And those are only a few of the many amazing things she did. A great review in the New York Times concludes, Civil Rights Queen is a balanced assessment of a brave and brilliant woman who helped to reconfigure the system before she became part of it. Brown-Nagin honors her subject by being resolutely direct and unsentimental. And in a starred review, Publishers Weekly says it's an immersive and eye-opening biography and names it one of their PW picks. And so now I'm really pleased to turn things over to tonight's speakers. Dean Brown-Nagin, the digital podium is yours.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here with my colleague, Randall Kennedy, to talk a little bit about my book on Constance Baker Motley. And we're going to start with a short reading. This is from the chapter of the book that discusses the James Meredith case, the case where Motley helped to desegregate the University of Mississippi. This man has got to be crazy, Thurgood Marshall shouted to Motley in January 1961. That's your case. Marshall had descended upon Motley's office waving a letter from James Meredith. The missive contained such a preposterous idea that Marshall thought the writer must be out of his mind. I am submitting an application for admission to the University of Mississippi, Meredith wrote, and I am anticipating encountering difficulty with the various agencies here in the state. In view of the brewing trouble, Meredith requested Marshall's legal assistance. Despite Meredith's conceit and missionary zeal, Marshall believed that he would be lucky to still be alive once whites caught wind of the plan. The very idea of a Black woman lawyer violently clashed with the worldview of Dugas Shands, who's the white Mississippi lawyer representing Ole Miss. At first, he ignored Motley altogether, but this strategy could not succeed. Shands had to accept Motley's personhood in the context of a trial. His second way of trying to consign her to a subordinate position worked better. He refused to address the Inc. Fund lawyer in the customary manner as Mrs. Motley. Instead, he used only indirect references, calling Motley her or she. At one point early on, Motley jumped to her feet in a bid to put an end to the charade. But the tipping point occurred when Shands called her Constance. Motley immediately objected. "I would like for Mr. Shands not to call me by my first name," she insisted. Henceforth, the lawyer referred to Motley as the New York counsel. After months of struggle and endless delays, Meredith had had enough. Browbeaten by ominous displays of white resistance, he wrote to Motley, resigned. He wanted to give up on his bid to enter Ole Miss. "I will not attempt to obtain an undergraduate degree from the University of Mississippi," the letter said. Keenly aware that Motley, who had poured herself into the case, would be disappointed in his decision, Meredith pleaded for understanding. "I am human, after all," he wrote. Meredith had grown tired of waiting for a deliverance that never came. Life had passed him by. His peers had graduated from college, begun careers, and moved on with their lives. In the meantime, he and his family had endured a high cost. Motley was stunned by the message. In order to salvage her case and support her client, Motley morphed from lawyer to therapist, a role she often played in high-stakes civil rights cases. Talking with him in her own living room, Motley cajoled Meredith. She persuaded him he had gone too far and that too much had been invested in the case by the Inc. Fund and the Federal Court of Appeals to abandon the litigation. Just as Meredith reached his breaking point, support arrived, precisely as Motley had promised. On September 10th, 1962, U.S. Supreme Court Justice Hugo Black intervened, halting any further action preventing James Meredith's matriculation to Ole Miss. While in Mississippi, Motley built community with a small band of lawyers, activists, and others who took part in the Inc. Fund's bid to end Jim Crow in Mississippi. She leaned on Medgar Evers, the NAACP's most prominent operative in Mississippi. Evers often invited Motley to his home. There, the lawyer enjoyed home-cooked meals and fellowship with Evers, his wife, their 3 children, and whoever else was passing by. Only 1 month after Motley left Mississippi for the last time, Medgar Evers was assassinated. It devastated her. Traumatized and despondent, she could not get out of bed for weeks following his death. She could not even bring herself to attend his funeral. Nevertheless, she left the state victorious. Constance Baker Motley emerged as one of the most respected lawyers in America. A story in the New York Times titled "Integration's Advocate" captured the professional heights to which she had soared. A tall, striking woman with piercing dark eyes is almost always in the courtroom in the eye of the hurricane surrounding the civil rights struggle in the South. Motley's successful fight to desegregate Ole Miss brought her public esteem and professional success, along with devastating loss and profound pain. Thank you. And now I'll invite Randy to offer his perspective.
Well, thank you very much. And the first thing I want to say is congratulations. This is a remarkable book. And it leads me to my first question, which is this. I mean, you're the dean of the Radcliffe Institute. You are a professor in the Faculty of Arts and Sciences. You're a professor at the law school. How in the world were you able, in the light of your, especially your administrative duties, again, as dean, how were you able to push this through the publication?
Hmm. Well, that is a very good question, Randy. And I have to say, I was just determined to get it done because I believed in the project so much. I'm an early riser, which helps. I worked on it before things got going in my household in the mornings. And I took time during the summer when I had snatches of time to work on the project. And over the course of what, 4 summers, 4 years, I finished the 3 chapters that were left to do once I took this position. So it wasn't easy. And I was warned that it would not be easy, but it really, I enjoy writing so much. I enjoy trying to construct a narrative, particularly about this subject, that will appeal to a wide audience, which is what I wanted to do. I thought it was worth my time and my effort to just make sure that Constance Baker Motley is as widely known as she deserves to be.
Well, your earlier book, your earlier prize-winning book, Courage to Dissent, in that book, you excavated and publicized the career of a lawyer who had been oft overlooked, A.T. Walden. And here in this new book, you are again excavating and publicizing the career of a Black attorney. What is it that impels you to want to focus on Black attorneys? What draws you to that subject?
Right. Well, these attorneys have done so much to change America, to give us the civil rights laws and these precedents like Brown versus Board of Education. Motley litigated the Atlanta desegregation case along with A.T. Walden, and they are heroic figures. They did that often under threat of their lives. They made sacrifices, and they are subjects who are worthy of study and worthy of being known. Randy, as you know from our work at the law school, there are lawyers who have mythical status, and they should be. Everybody knows who they are. And I wanted to add these lawyers to that roll call of great figures in American history, because they helped to give us the world in which we live today and to create opportunity for us, specifically for us. And they're inspiring figures. So I'm happy to have spent this part of my career, a long part of my career, doing that job of excavating and telling the world about these figures, and doing so in a way that is true, nuanced, balanced. I don't want to write hagiography. And so I always try in my work to put these figures in a context where they're interacting with other figures who may have disagreed with their perspective or their tactics. And it is enjoyable to do so. It's very rewarding.
You mentioned at the outset the case from Mississippi, Meredith versus Fair. And I mean, it is an absolutely extraordinary saga, just that one case.
Yes.
But of course, she, your subject, was part of a whole slew of cases. Why don't you, is there another one? Could you share another case that comes to mind that really shows us the importance of Constance Baker Motley as litigator? I just might mention, I mean, I have spoken with people who talked about just taking a long trip just to see her in the courthouse. They didn't really actually know what the argument was about, but it was just an extraordinary thing just to see a Black woman in a courthouse. I mean, people, this was really quite a remarkable and inspiring thing alone. again, are there other cases that come to mind that illuminate the significance of Constance Baker Motley as litigator?
Sure. Yeah, there are so many. You know, the phenomenon that you're describing, few people had seen a Black lawyer, few people had seen a woman lawyer, and she was this extraordinary combination of a Black woman lawyer. And it was very surprising. She, in her memoir, describes it as it's like a circus was in town, because people would come to the courthouse and they really wanted to see what, as she was called then, this Negro woman from New York who was traveling with other Black lawyers could do. They were confronting white authority, doing so in places like Mississippi, so repressive. You know, I talk about how in my book, how Motley, her first trial was in Mississippi on a teacher salary equalization case. And she litigates a case with Bob Carter. And the Inc. Fund lawyers always have to have local counsel. Mm-hmm. The one they worked with on this case in Mississippi was Jess Brown. And she talks about how Jess Brown displayed his subservience in the courtroom by walking bent. He would walk bent over, you know, making himself small. And there she was with Bob Carter, standing tall. She was nearly 6 feet tall. And the very act of her, you know, putting white figures, white men on the stand, asking them to justify, to explain why it was that an African-American teacher who maybe had a master's degree was making so much less than a white teacher who was not as well educated. And it was just extraordinary to behold. There's a case of the UGA case she litigated with Charlene Hunter Galt and Hamilton Holmes as the plaintiffs. They were, the best plaintiffs ever, she called them. And it was because they were from great families. They were good looking. They had great grades. They were respectable. And she and Vernon Jordan had to drive back and forth from Atlanta to Athens every day during that trial, because of course there was no place for them to stay. Black people couldn't stay in hotels in Athens or eat at restaurants in Athens. And so they were tired going back and forth. They often were hungry. And yet, as you say, she was just a wonder in the courtroom. She put the registrar for the University of Georgia on the stand and just interrogated him about the applications that she had found. She did all of this work herself, the legal team did. Going through those applications and asking questions about why a white student had been let in. Why was the student allowed to, why was he admitted and allowed to stay on campus when Hamilton Holmes had been told that it was too late to register, there was no housing, etc. And there's this wonderful scene I described where the judge in the case, Judge Tuttle, when she's cross-examining this white registrar, he just starts giggling because she's just so darn good. She just pounds and pounds and pounds, and she's unafraid. And she does this time and time again. She does it in numerous cases, and it is just inspiring to think of her, to write about her, and inspiring because she has such great skills as a litigator, and she's so courageous. It's just a joy to write this book.
You know, one feature of your book that really jumps out at me is, on the one hand, it is very celebratory. Obviously you were moved by your subject and others who were just doing extraordinary things under very difficult circumstances. At the same time, your book is not hagiography. It is realistic. And I bet that in the coming weeks and months, as the book is reviewed and as there's discussion, there are aspects of your book that I think will probably lead to some degree of controversy, and I want to talk about this.
Okay.
In particular, there are two features of, well, there's Mr. Civil Rights. Mr. Civil Rights, Thurgood Marshall. First Black justice on the Supreme Court, first Black Solicitor General, just, towering figure. But there are two places in which you really force people to come to grips with aspects of Justice Marshall's career that have really not been focused upon much. And I want to talk about those two. First, one goes to the index of your book and, Thurgood Marshall, and one comes across the following on page 482. Sexual objectification of Motley by. That's a pretty unpack that for us, please.
Yeah. Well, here's the incident. It is said that when Motley first came in seeking employment from at the LDF, at the Inc. Fund, it was a very informal kind of interview. And during the course of the interview, while he's talking to her about, these women teachers whom he had known who were so important to him, and his mother, and, he was just wowed by her, the student at Columbia Law School. He also evidently asked her to stand on a ladder to observe her feminine form. And, in the book, I talk about how it's only because we've come so far as a society, we have laws against sexual harassment and so forth, that episode is so, it makes us cringe. Okay. But it's not something that is in any way surprising for the period in which they were living. And one of the ways I came to terms with this and came to understand what I should say about that episode was by looking at, Jet magazine and Ebony from the period. And as you well know, Jet magazine had a centerfold, a woman in a swimsuit until very, very, recently. It was very, yes. So this kind of admiration, and it was considered admiration of a woman's beauty, was just par for the course, just par for the course. And I also want to say, objectification is different from some other things. I'm not claiming that he harassed her, that he was anything other than, supportive of her. They were mentor and mentee, and in those relationships, it's not always smooth, and not every aspect of those relationships is wonderful. And I thought it important to to get that out there. It's important. It's something that I would imagine is highly relatable to women. And so the difference that this biography makes in part is by telling the story of professional life through the lens of gender, through the eyes of a woman. That is what I seek to do, and I think it's important to do that.
Thank you. I want to, there's a second issue.
Yeah.
And it has to do with the succession crisis at the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. I mean, Thurgood Marshall had been the undisputed head, very successful, widely admired. And then he, in I guess it was 1961, he gets a judgeship. John F. Kennedy is going to nominate him to the United States Court of Appeals. And so, and he's going to take it, and that leaves an opening. Who now will lead the NAACP Legal Defense Fund? And there was basically a competition, and there was a pushing and shoving. Constance Baker Motley was amongst the people who, was a very plausible successor. She did not get the nod. Jack Greenberg got the nod. And you talk about this in my view, a very telling way. You talk about this in a way that I think many people have really, sort of shied away from, because it's you talk about things that are very touchy. Talk about things, people have really, to this day, strong feelings. There are real, there's wounds out there. Tell the story, please.
So the story, as you say, there was an opening, and a number of lawyers competing, Black lawyers, as well as Jack Greenberg, who is very close to Thurgood Marshall and just a fantastic lawyer who contributed so much to the civil rights movement and to the Inc. Fund. At this time, it's 1961, just 6 years after Brown versus Board of Education. There is an assumption that the successor of Thurgood Marshall will be another Black lawyer, one of the fine Black lawyers available for the role, because it seems that he needs to send a signal at a time when Black lawyers were not, they had not made their place in the legal profession yet, that he had confidence in a Black lawyer to lead this civil rights organization. And Motley was among those lawyers who was interested in the post, and she was passed over. Jack Greenberg got the nod. And the question is, what went into that decision? And this is the perspective that I bring to it. I do not wish to, and I have not in that chapter tried to judge whether the right successor was chosen. Instead, I'm looking at that incident again through Motley's eyes to talk about these touchy issues. So one of them is, whether a Black lawyer should have succeeded Thurgood Marshall for the legitimacy that would confer at that time. Then gender is another lens through which I look at the issue. And, Motley says that although she was qualified, she was interested. There were people who thought that she would and had earned that role. She didn't get it, and she thought that gender had something to do with it. And again, I pull back and I note that there is no civil rights organization at the time, no public interest organization at the time, no private law firm at the time that has a woman in such a prominent position. It would have been extraordinarily progressive had that happened. But again, the context is important to consider, even as I try to do justice to Motley's thoughts about it. And then I conclude the chapter by noting that the story, the public story that Motley tells about Thurgood Marshall is laudatory. She notes that Thurgood Marshall made her career. If it had not been for Thurgood Marshall, no one ever would have heard of Constance Baker Motley, she says. He hired a woman lawyer in 1945 as a law student, and then in 1946 at a time when others were just not doing that. She had been turned away by private law firms in New York. And so when she looked at the span of her career, what she concludes, as do I, is that Thurgood Marshall did something phenomenal by having her on his legal team for so many years. And I think it's important to tell a story that's a both and story. It's not that one is a villain or a hero. It's not that either you support a woman or you don't. There are gray zones. There are times when, as in this instance, there are practical decisions that are made that may not be about how meritorious a particular candidate is. A lot of factors have to be considered. And I think that is what happened in this instance. And I also want to say that Jack Greenberg was just incredible. And there's nothing there's nothing about telling her story that is meant to cast aspersions on Jack Greenberg. Not at all. He did a terrific job in that role.
I have a couple questions about Motley as judge. Here too, I read Judge Motley's memoir and other things, but gosh, you brought to the fore stuff that certainly I didn't know about. So let's start with one. The struggle over the confirmation and the controversy having to do with this investigation into her background and had she had any dealings with the Communist Party, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Could you go into that a bit?
Sure. Well, when she was nominated, there was an investigation. There's an FBI background check, as there is for any person nominated for judgeship. And one of the things turned up was her association with leftists when she was a student at NYU and when she was in New Haven. Of course, there were those who took this and they ran with it, accusing her of being a communist, casting aspersions on her character, on her patriotism. And, it was at a time, it wasn't the worst accusation that could be made in 1966. The worst of the witch hunt was over by then. The FBI was by that time focused on Black Power advocates and other kinds of dissenters, but it was difficult for her, and she had to be interviewed by the FBI, and she had to try to recall her associates and justify and say whether or not she was a communist. And in that context, Thurgood Marshall stood up for her, Jack Greenberg stood up for her, as did a number of civil rights leaders. and she was confirmed. And a part of why that aspersion did not stick was, first of all, there was no hard evidence that she was ever a member of the Communist Party, although certainly she was in the company of leftists, as many people were. But it also was clear that Jim Eastland, who was the head of the Judiciary Committee at that time, senator from Mississippi, it was a pretext, right? So this is the same woman who had litigated the Ole Miss case. And he was not happy that she was nominated, and this was used against her, and fortunately it did not work.
Okay. You talk about Judge Motley's jurisprudence. One of the cases that struck me and that I think has a current resonance, a special resonance, has to do with her role as a judge in cases involving prisoners' rights. And there was one case in particular with this prisoner Sostre.
Yeah, Sostre, yeah.
And it was a remarkable case, very important case. I mean, this was a time when, it was at the dawn of the period of prisoners having any rights. But she really shook things up. And my sense is that there were colleagues of hers who really looked askance at her willingness to hold prisons to account, to ask questions, and to ultimately rule in favor of a prisoner. Could you talk more about that?
Yeah. So this was the most surprising ruling that I came upon of Motley's. It's critically important. The argument that I make about her jurisprudence generally is that she was pretty middle of the road. She was a pragmatist. There were those who claimed, and including during recusal motions, that because she'd been a civil rights lawyer, she was going to be biased in favor of civil rights plaintiffs, women, Black people, etc. And that is just not what I found. If anything, her expertise as a civil rights lawyer meant that she could snuff out weak cases, and that is what she did. And yet in this case, she did side with Sostre, who was a jailhouse lawyer who was relegated to solitary confinement, and brought an action alleging that solitary confinement and the conditions of confinement violated his constitutional rights. And there was a long trial. It was, it was a spectacle. There were all kinds of leftist Black Panthers in the courtroom, and she ruled in his favor after hearing from expert witnesses about the damage that solitary confinement does to the human psyche. She ruled that the confinement was a violation of the 8th Amendment. She also held that the prison wardens confiscating of materials from Sostre's lawyer or trying to prevent him from mailing out materials was a violation of his rights, that they had retaliated against him. And it was just extraordinary. It was a socially transformative, far ahead of the time opinion, and there was tremendous blowback. It was reported in the New York Times. Law enforcement was angry with her. White prisoners were angry because it was said that, this Black man was getting the special treatment. She actually awarded him damages. And she was, part of the ruling was upheld, part of it was reversed by the Second Circuit. But yes, it was extraordinary. And although she was partly reversed, she stood by that decision. She stood by that decision, which, set the Court of Appeals on fire, because she thought it was right. It was right under the law. And it was the closest, I think, she came to being a kind of gladiator on the bench in the way that she had been as a lawyer. And I was so pleased to find that case and to talk about it. Turns out that Constance Baker Motley was, at the dawn of mass incarceration. She understood in a way that many people still don't, that, incarcerated people are entitled to their dignity, entitled to constitutional rights. And it's a great case.
I'm going to have, for myself, one more question, because one of the great things about the Harvard Bookstore sessions like this is that we have engaged audience, and there are a number of questions. I'm going to ask one more, and then I'm going to read off some of the questions from the audience. My question has to do with the current moment. There is there's a vacancy, will soon be a vacancy at the Supreme Court. The President of the United States has said that he is going to nominate a Black woman to fill that vacancy. So what are you thinking, having just written this book?
Yeah.
Your book has just come out, and we are now on the cusp of, seeing what developments will be, but it looks like there's going to be, finally, belatedly, a Black woman on the Supreme Court. What are you thinking about with, your book and this new headline?
Yeah, so great timing, I have to say, in that this book, Motley's Experience, is highly relevant to this moment. She was on short list, certainly for the Second Circuit, also for the Supreme Court, and obviously did not end up getting the nod. Part of the reason that she did not get the nod was because of cases, I think, like the prisoners' rights case. She was said to be too liberal. I talk about how her background as a civil rights lawyer, being the civil rights queen, is a double-edged sword. So her identity was weaponized, to use a word that is tossed around today, against her. It was said that she couldn't be fair to white people, to males, etc., and it cost her. And I will say, one of the lessons that I hope we have learned is one, that every lawyer who is qualified needs to have the opportunity to stand for these positions, to be considered for these positions. And that is regardless of their practice background. There are a couple of candidates, at least one candidate, two candidates, I would say, who are on the short list, who come from public interest backgrounds, including Sherilyn Ifill, who, of course, is the Director Counsel of the NAACP Legal Defense Fund. It's important that those backgrounds are represented, that certainly they're not punished in the way that Motley essentially was punished for being a civil rights lawyer. It's strange to even say it. How is it that the civil rights lawyer who had done so much to improve this country, to make it better, to ensure that there were civil rights laws, ends up being at a disadvantage when it came time to be considered for a judgeship? So we need to ensure that that story about Motley is known, and that isn't replicated. And it's also important for us to appreciate that, the administration has to be prepared for the slings and arrows that will come. And they will come no matter how brilliant, how qualified the woman is. They will come. And they need to be anticipated. They need to be prepared. They need to have her back, to put it in relatable terms. And I hope that telling Motley's story will encourage people to do that. This appointment has been a long time coming, and we're now on the precipice of evidently a Black woman on the Supreme Court. It is symbolically important. At the same time, what ultimately has to be said about this appointment is that there are eminently qualified women who can do this job, and that needs to be driven home over and over again.
A member of our audience wants to take us to the beginning of your subject's career. How can you tell us how Motley came to be a lawyer in the first place?
Sure. Well, she wasn't meant to be a lawyer. If one considers her background, she was from a working class background in New Haven, from an immigrant household. Her parents were West Indian. They didn't have money even to send her to college, much less to law school. When she said to friends and family members that she wanted to be a lawyer, she was told that she was crazy because women didn't get anywhere in the law. She was advised by her mother to become a hairdresser because everybody needs to get their hair done, right? It was a reliable profession, particularly for women, but she was inspired. She was inspired by Jane Bolin, who was the Yale Law School graduate who was appointed to the court, one of the domestic relations courts in New York. She was inspired by Abraham Lincoln when she read about him as a high school student. And she wanted to be a lawyer. And fortunately for her, she participated in a community center discussion in New Haven where a philanthropist overheard her speaking, and Clarence Blakesley, and he volunteered to pay her tuition to college and to law school. And thus she was able to go to law school, pursue this dream. It was not easy. She talks about how she survived Columbia Law School. It was not, a particularly welcoming environment. There were very few women, but she made it through, and she ended up being one of the lawyers who helped to make civil rights law.
What about Motley as a person? I mean, you spent a lot of time with this person. At the end of the day, I don't know, likable? Would you, would you, under different circumstances, let's just do a sort of a time capsule, would you all have been friends?
I think we would have, Randy. I did like her. I felt as if I understood her. She was reserved. She did not aspire to be the center of attention. There's a reason that people repeatedly refer to her as a queen. She was regal, imperious. Her parents had taught her that she was a part of a special people as a West Indian, and she carried herself in a way that communicated that she was sort of apart from others, and yet she was a woman on a mission. She was highly intelligent, and I certainly came away from this book just admiring her. She was an inspiration, and one of the things, Randy, that I really admired about her is that she was the first, but she made sure that she was not the last. She was a mentor to generations of lawyers. She mentored judges, including, she was friends with Sonia Sotomayor, the Associate Justice of the Supreme Court. She hired she implemented the Civil Rights Act in her own chambers. She hired law clerks who had graduated from Harvard and Columbia and other prestigious institutions, but who were not getting looks from other judges. She hired them and she inspired them. And ultimately, she was so courageous. And I certainly did like her. And, writing a biography, it would be hard to write a biography to spend so much time with someone that you found unlikable. And, she was a great individual.
Well, some biographers do. I mean, you're around, you find out a lot about people, and there are any number who they come in admiring their subject, but they lose esteem as they learn more about their subject. It seems that's not the case with you. You just reading the book, you're not sentimental, but you are admiring, and it's just a wonderful book that you've written. I'll just add, I've heard two very distinguished male lawyers talk with admiration about Constance Baker Motley. One was Derek Bell, who was junior to her.
Yes.
But who just, he spoke in the most, frankly, reverential terms about her. And another person who spoke very highly of her, and I will say this, he was very tough. He didn't have a whole lot to say about many lawyers, was Thurgood Marshall. When the few times that I heard him speak about Constance Baker Motley, he definitely respected and admired her. This has really been wonderful. Again, I want to congratulate you on this really formidable piece of scholarship. It's a sort of work that, I hope lots of people will read it right away. But frankly, 10 years from now, it's a book that'll be on library shelves and people will be mining it for years to come. So congratulations, and thanks for talking with me this evening.
Well,
go ahead, please.
Well, thank you for being here, Brandy. I appreciate the depth of your questions. It's been a truly enjoyable conversation. Thank you.
I think that the folks from the bookstore are going to come back, and what say you?
I say, as an audience member, what an amazing conversation the two of you had. To be able to sort of be a fly on the wall for that was wonderful for me, and I'm sure for the rest of our audience members as well. So I just want to thank you both once again for being here. And I also want to thank everyone out there in virtual land for spending your evening with us. You can learn more about Civil Rights Clean and purchase it at harvard.com or via the link that I did put in the chat. And on behalf of Harvard Bookstore in Cambridge, Massachusetts, have a wonderful night. Keep reading, and be careful of your back when you're shoveling snow tomorrow if you're in our region. Have a great night, everyone. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.